welcome back to another video. I've set myself another crazy deadline. I sometimes will just decide that I have a deadline for myself and I'm like, yeah, I have to do this in this time frame. And that's it. Once I set my mind to something, I'm very difficult to deter. Today is Thursday, the 15th, and it's currently 3:30 in the afternoon. On Saturday, the 17th, I am going to an event called the Harry Potter in Concert. Basically, you watch one of the Harry Potter movies with the music being played live by an orchestra, and it's so cool. I'm really excited about it, and I like to wear like a theme outfit every time because I'm me. This year I decided that I wanted to make a new dress, even though I just made a Harry Potter Hufflepuff uniform in August last year. If you haven't seen that series, it's on my channel, but I still have a bunch of fabric left. This is the Minerva range polyester suiting in the color gold, and I mean, like, this is the perfect Hufflepuff color. I want to make a dress that is like sort of like this dress I made a while ago, like last year. I wear this dress all the time. I wish I had more colors of this dress, and so I'm making a yellow version, not only to wear to this event, but just also it'll fill a gap in my wardrobe. I'm not that nervous about the making of it. I've made this dress before and it's really simple. Let's jump into it. So before I do anything, I need to get a fun playlist on to keep me pumped and clean my desk. I usually tidy my desk after every project and then deep clean it about once a week. Anyway, I'm just putting things away, and I wanted to show you this adorable embroidery that I finished recently. I need to add a photo to the center, which will be held up by the little triangles of thread, but it's so cute. I love it. Anyway, I keep tidying, and then I give my machine a clean as well because it's starting to make a noise that I know means clean me, and I gave it a bit of an oil too, just for good measure. And then I started placing my pattern pieces on the fabric. I will link everything I use below as always. The fabric is the poly suiting from Minerva, like I said before, and the pattern I'm using is the fringed cocktail dress from Gertie's Ultimate Dress book. I love this book because all the pattern components can be mixed and matched, so you get near infinite possibilities. The components I used here are the strapless sweetheart bodice and the pencil skirt, and then I added my own straps. Then I cut out all of my pieces and also the notches on those pieces too. I couldn't decide if I wanted to use this same suiting fabric to line the bodice or use the lining that I used on my Hufflepuff uniform suit, but I found some scraps from that suit and decided to use those instead of cutting into the suiting because I didn't think I was going to use the scraps for anything else. I had to do a bit of puzzling to get them all in there and ended up having to add a center front seam, but I got all the pieces cut and moved on. I checked my box of trims to see if I had some bias made out of this suiting fabric, and thanks to my hoarding tendencies, I did have some, so I didn't have to make any bias for this, which was great. I'm going to be using the bias as boning channels, by the way. When everything has been cut, I actually started transferring my markings, which is in this case is just the darts on the skirt pieces, since everything else is just notches. And then to start the batch pinning, I pinned the skirt darts first. There's 2 on the front piece and then 2 on each back piece. I also pinned all the bodice seams as well as the bodice lining seams. The princess seamed pieces at the front are the most challenging, but by lining up the notches and taking things slow, they're really very manageable. And then I moved on to stitching all of those seams. At this point, I also sewed up the straps. Since I've made many straps for myself before, I know how big I need the strips of fabric to be, so I cut an offcut that I'd saved with this measurement in mind. Then with right sides together, I stitched all along the selvage, and then I stitched another line about 3 centimeters away. I cut about 1/2 centimeter away from that second stitching line and then repeated the process for the second strap with the leftover fabric. I trimmed the seam allowances on both straps and turned them right side out using the safety pin method. I also gave them a really good press, making sure that the seams are sitting where I want them to be. And while I have my iron out, I also pressed the darts on the skirt pieces, and then I pressed all of the seams open on both bodices after clipping the curved seams. Before I start assembling the skirt pieces, I went ahead and serged the raw edges on all the side seams to save me having to switch between machines later. This kind of batch sewing and planning is how I manage to sew garments so quickly, but it does come with practice, and sewing is my job. but if you're still learning to sew, don't worry about efficiency and speed. It'll come with time. Now I can pin the skirt back pieces to the skirt front along the sides. And in this batch of pinning, I'm also going to cut out the bias for my boning channels to the size of each seam and pin that in place. To create invisible boning channels, I'm going to stitch the bias to the seam allowances only. When I finish adding the boning channels, I like to do a stay stitch along the bottom of the bodice, and that is just to close the bottom of the boning channels. So it's now the next day, and I actually had to stop for two reasons. One, I was getting quite tired, but mostly is because I didn't have any zip ties, and I needed some for the boning of the bodice. So I went and got some today. I got some bigger ones than I need just because I'll keep these in my stash for future projects, especially if I want to make like corsets. I would need this kind of size of zip tie. I got 2 packs of 25, which is way more than I need for this project. I like to have in my stash this kind of thing so that I can use it without needing to go out and buy things. And it's actually 5:30 now. I haven't done any sewing today. I've been working on other things that I've had to do, but I think that I can probably do majority of the sewing today, and then maybe tomorrow, if I haven't finished everything today, then tomorrow I can finish the finishing touches, like the hems and the things that I need to sew by hand and that kind of thing. Let's keep trucking along and hopefully we make it in time for tomorrow. I mean, I think I'm gonna make it in time either way, even if I don't make that much progress today, because I have the whole day tomorrow, so should be okay. I have some little scraps here from this project that I'm going to cut little samples out of to stick in my sewing journal before I put the journal away to keep on sewing. I use this journal to keep track of all my makes. I leave notes on construction, pattern, fit, and even the fabric, and I always take note of what fabrics I used. So whenever I need to tag a certain fabric in a post or a video that I can't remember the name of, I check my little journal. Moving on to adding the boning to the bodice, I'm going to mark out the seam allowance on the bodice on both the top and bottom of the boning channels first. Then I'll place the zip tie between the seam allowances and cut it. I like to file down the tips and edges to avoid it ripping my fabric or poking into me, but with the zip ties you could also use like a lighter or a candle to heat seal them into shape. But that smells worse and it usually leads to burns in my clumsy hands, so I stick to the file. Once I'm happy with the lack of pointiness of the zip ties, I slip them into the boning channels and add a pin to the top to keep them in there. And then repeat that for all of the boning channels. Before I stitch the top of the boning channels closed, I'm going to pin the straps in place to do it all in one go. I pin the fronts of the straps to the side front seams, and then the backs of the straps to the side back seams. Then I stay stitch the top to tack the straps in place and close the top of the boning channels, making sure that whenever I sew near a boning channel, I am pushing the boning away from that seam to keep from sewing over it. I'm also going to heat seal the sides of one of my tags and stitch that to the lining of the bodice. And I still haven't stitched the skirt side seams that I pinned on day 1, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Next, I can pin the bodice lining to the bodice, making sure that all my seams are matching up. And then obviously I stitch them together, making sure the boning is not in the way of my needle as I go. I trim the seam allowance and then I press it towards the lining so that I can do a bit of understitching here. While the iron is out, I'm also going to press the side seams of my skirt open. Next, I'm going to do the understitching at the top of the bodice lining, and this is just sewing the seam allowance to the facing or the lining to keep everything firmly in place without any visible stitching on your actual garment. After understitching, I also like to give it all another good press to make sure that it's all sitting where it should be. Finally, I could pin the bodice to the skirt with right sides together, keeping the lining free and making sure that my side seams are matching up. I also matched the side front seams to the darts on the front of the skirt and the side back seams of the bodice to one of the darts of the back of the skirt. Next, I stitched that in place, again taking care to avoid the boning. I did cut a couple of the bones a little too long, but I found out that my machine sews through zip ties just fine, so I guess that's good to know, but I will generally be avoiding making her do that anyway. Then I trimmed the seam allowances and pressed them toward the bodice.
I accidentally cut the seam allowance a little bit too small, so it was a bit hard to press, but it's okay. And while I've got my iron on, I also pressed the seam allowance of the bodice lining in to make it easier to sew it later, and Zeus is going somewhere. If you can ever hear those little tippy tappies in the background, it's just Zeus walking around between his sun puddle and his bed. Anyway, the last thing I did on day 2 was press my zipper in preparation for sewing it in. This is a trick that makes your invisible zipper sewing a lot easier by pressing the zipper teeth away from the tape. So far, I've worked on this dress over 2 days, but really only about 2 to 3 hours on the first one, Thursday, and about 1.5 hours on the second day, Friday. So on Saturday, aka the day of the event, I only had the zipper, the center back seam, and the finishings to do. I started by pinning the zipper in place with right sides together, which for some reason I never get right on the first try. I lined up the plastic stopper at the top with the top of my dress, and yes, my bodice is slightly larger than the skirt, so I am pinning my zipper on a kind of diagonal. To stitch the zipper in place, I switched over to a zipper sewing foot, and that's my second secret to a perfect invisible zip, with secret number 1 obviously being the pressing thing. Although kind of not a secret anymore since I tell you all about this literally anytime I have to sew a zipper in a video, but you get it. Okay, there may be a third secret. To make sure that the waistline matches on both sides of the zipper, after I stitch the first side in, I close the zip, match up the waistline so I can pin the zipper on the remaining side exactly where the waistlines meet. Then I open the zip, pin the rest of the zipper like normal, stitch it the same way as the other side, and voila. Once I've got my zipper sewn in, I can close the center back seam, which thanks to the slit of the skirt is very small. So I pin it closed starting at the top of the slit up to the zip, and when I stitch that in place, I have to make sure that the center back seam stitching line is perfectly meeting up to the zipper stitching line so that I don't get a weird bump at the end of the zip. And to finish off the end of the zipper, I'm cutting off the ends of the tape and then also a little bit of the zipper teeth that is left so that I can fold the little tabs that are left over each other to form a kind of triangle, and then I stitch that in place. And then to make sure that it's all secure, I use my lighter to heat seal it, and I move on to pressing that seam open as well as pressing my zipper in place. The slit openings of this dress have a bit more seam allowance than the center back seam, so to hem them, I first pressed all the seam allowance in using the center back seam as a guide. And then I pressed the raw edges of the slits under so that they would be hidden, and I pinned them in place. I also went ahead and pinned the folded edge of the bodice lining over the waistline seam, and I then stitched both of those by hand. I was going to do the same thing for the hem of the dress, and that's really all the footage that I have left. I actually went off camera to do all the pressing because it's boring and easier to do on my big ironing board, and then while I was doing that, I was getting very sleepy because I hadn't slept very well the night before and desperately wanted to nap, which is when I remembered that I had some of that prim hemming tape left. So I fished it out of the trimmings box, and wouldn't you know, I had more than enough to hem this dress. So I quickly serged the raw edge of the hem and applied the hemming web and finished the dress in time to have a grand old nap and still walk Zeus before I had to even get ready for the event.
So there we have the finished result. I'm really happy with this dress. I think it looks really cute. It's exactly what I thought it was going to be. I'm glad I remembered to use the hemming tape instead of doing the whole thing by hand because it did save me quite a lot of time. Yeah, we had a lot of fun at the event. It was great. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions about the construction or about any of the techniques that I showed you in this video. And also maybe let me know what you'd like me to make next. That would really be helpful. Tell me what you've been working on. I'd love to know. I'm very curious. I'd also like to remind you to subscribe to my channel if you haven't done that already. It would really mean a lot to me. I would also like to let you know that I have a website with all of my links, which I'll leave down below. Next week, we're going to be doing some
comparing and contrasting to, you know, my sewing skills of a few years ago and what they are now. So that's going to be fun, hopefully. Yeah, that's everything from me for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.